He had always believed he was invincible, a man who could shape the world around him with just a snap of his fingers. But everything changed the moment his daughter's life was placed in the hands of a doctor he had already judged, a doctor who was black. What happens when the only person who can save your child is someone you've unfairly judged? Can you let go of your prejudices and trust them with the most precious thing in your life? Will his ingrained biases cost him the one thing he loves most? Or will he learn a lesson that forces him to reconsider everything he's believed? Before we dive into this heart-wrenching journey, tell us in the comments where you're watching or listening from today. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that make you think. It started like any other day for Jacob Fenton, a man of wealth, influence, and control. He was used to bending the world to his will. His business empire spanned multiple states, and the respect he commanded was earned through decades of cutthroat success. Yet nothing in his years of dominance could have prepared him for the phone call that shattered his world. Mr. Fenton, the voice on the other end was cold, clinical. Your daughter, Emily, she's in the hospital. There's been an accident. Time seemed to slow, the words barely sinking in. Emily, his only child, his reason for everything, had been hurt. He didn't even wait for more details. His heart pounded in his chest as he rushed to the hospital, his mind reeling. His luxury SUV sliced through the heavy New York traffic, but all he could think about was her. Emily, please be okay. Arriving at the hospital, the chaos of medical staff, the bright lights, and the sharp antiseptic smells surrounded him, but nothing could pierce his frantic thoughts. He stormed into the ER, his voice sharp, commanding, desperate. Where's Emily? Emily Fenton. I need to see her now. His reputation preceded him, but the nurse, calm and composed, didn't flinch. Room 4-12, Mr. Fenton. The doctors are with her now. Doctors? The word barely registered as Jacob rushed through the sterile, endless corridors, his focus fixated only on one thing, his daughter. When he finally reached the room, his breath caught in his throat. There she was, his vibrant, beautiful 16-year-old girl, lying motionless, pale as death. Tubes and wires connected her to machines, the beep of the heart monitor the only sound in the room. Please God, not her. A nurse was adjusting in for drip, but Jacob's gaze was fixed on the man standing at the foot of the bed. The doctor was tall, calm, and black. A stethoscope hung around his neck, his eyes focused on the chart in his hands. I'm Dr. Samuel Green, the man said, extending his hand. But Jacob didn't move. His eyes narrowed as his mind screamed, who is this man? I'm Emily's father. Jacob's voice was ice cold, his eyes fixed on the doctor. What happened to her? Why are you treating her? Dr. Green, unshaken, lowered his hand and spoke with authority. Your daughter suffered a severe head injury and internal trauma. We're monitoring her closely, but the next few hours are critical. Critical? And you're the one treating her? Yes, Dr. Green said, unfazed. I specialize in trauma. I'm the lead physician overseeing her care. Jacob's stomach churned. Is there no one else? Dr. Green didn't flinch. We've done the initial scans. We need to monitor her for swelling in the brain. Time is of the essence. Quickly and precisely, Jacob repeated to himself, feeling his anger surge. You're talking about my daughter's life here. I want the best care for her. Do you understand? I'm providing the best care, Mr. Fenton, Dr. Green replied steadily. But Jacob's distress flared. The doctor was calm, confident. It gnawed at Jacob. A black doctor, handling my daughter's life? The feeling was ugly. It was unspoken, but it was there. He could feel it deep within him. A preconception he had never fully examined until now. I'm going to need a second opinion, Jacob said sharply, his words heavy with authority. This is my daughter. I won't take any chances. Dr. Green's expression remained neutral, but his eyes glinted with understanding. You're welcome to seek a second opinion, Mr. Fenton, but I advise you to focus on your daughter's care. Time is precious. Frustration swelled in Jacob's chest. Before he could respond, a nurse entered the room with an update on Emily's vitals. Dr. Green nodded, turning to check the charts, but Jacob remained frozen. His emotions were a volatile mix of fear, anger, and something else. He had always prided himself on making decisions that protected his family. But now he was powerless. The decisions were being made by someone he had already judged. And he couldn't understand why it felt so wrong. The hours dragged by. Jacob sat by Emily's side, watching her chest rise and fall, the machines keeping her alive. Nurse after nurse came and went, but Dr. Green remained, his presence unshakable, monitoring every aspect of Emily's condition with calm precision. Jacob's thoughts spiraled. He had to trust this man, didn't he? He had to, because this was about Emily's life. But how could he? Every inch of him rebelled against it. As the minutes turned to hours, Jacob wrestled with his mind. His control, his power, they were useless here. Sitting in this sterile room, he had no say. The decisions were out of his hands. And that gnawed at him. His phone buzzed, but Jacob ignored it. His empire could wait. Nothing mattered more than Emily's survival. Then the door opened. A familiar face entered. Charles Reed, his business partner, had rushed to the hospital the moment he heard about the accident. "Jacob," Charles said softly, his voice laced with concern. "How is she?" "She's hanging on," Jacob whispered, his voice breaking. "But I don't know. I don't know if she's going to make it." Charles stepped closer, placing a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "She's strong. She'll make it." But Jacob wasn't so sure. This Dr. Green. "I don't trust him." Charles raised an eyebrow. "You don't trust him? Why?" Jacob hesitated. How could he say it out loud? How could he admit that he was questioning the competence of this doctor? Simply because of his race. "I just don't feel comfortable," Jacob muttered, looking away. "I need to find someone else." Charles studied Jacob's face. The tension, the fear, the confusion. "Jacob," he said slowly, "if you're making this decision based on who the doctor is, rather than what he's doing, you might be making a mistake." Jacob snapped, his anger rising. "I'm not being irrational. This is my daughter's life. I have the right to make sure she's in the best hands." "You do," Charles said evenly, his voice calm. "But you need to ask yourself, are you letting your own biases get in the way here?" The word bias hit Jacob like a slap. He recoiled, but Charles was right. Was he being unfair? Had his life of privilege and control blinded him to the truth? Was this about his daughter's survival, or his own deeply ingrained prejudices? The tension hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. Jacob didn't know what to believe anymore. Finally, Charles sighed, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "Jacob, I understand you're scared," he said softly, his voice tinged with understanding. "We all are. But I think you need to trust the people who are here to help your daughter. If you want another doctor, fine. But don't let this be about anything other than what's best for her." Jacob didn't respond. His jaw was still clenched tightly, every muscle in his body tense, as he absorbed Charles's words. With a small nod, Charles left the room, leaving Jacob alone once again with his thoughts. And with Dr. Green. The hours crawled by, each second a reminder of his helplessness. Jacob found himself pacing the hospital hallways, his emotions swirling in a tempest of fear and anger. Emily's condition was still critical, and the helplessness gnawed at him like a relentless tide. He was used to being the one in control, used to being the man who made the decisions, who fixed the problems. But now, with his daughter's life hanging in the balance, all of his usual defenses seemed to crumble. He passed by nurses, patients, doctors, everyone moving with purpose, yet he felt as if he were standing still, stuck in a moment of time. His mind raced with possibilities, questions circling like vultures. How could he just sit back and trust this doctor? How could he let someone he didn't know, someone he didn't trust, take charge of Emily's life? How? When he finally returned to Emily's room, Dr. Green was there, calmly checking her charts. The doctor glanced up as Jacob entered, offering him a brief nod before returning to his work. Jacob didn't waste any time. "How is she?" he asked, his voice tight, strained. Dr. Green paused, setting the chart down carefully before responding. "She's stable for now," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "But we're still watching her closely for any changes. It's too early to tell, but I'm optimistic." Jacob's heart did a strange twist at the words. The small flicker of hope that rose within him quickly extinguished by the weight of his anxiety. He stood there, arms crossed tightly, staring at his daughter's pale face. The sight of her so still, so fragile, made his stomach churn. It almost doesn't seem real, he thought. She's not supposed to be like this. Dr. Green broke the silence, his voice measured. "Mr. Fenton," he said, addressing him with a calm authority that only made Jacob's anger flare. I know this is a difficult time for you, but I want to assure you that we're doing everything we can to help Emily. Jacob's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe him, God, how he wanted to believe him. But the doubt still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. His eyes locked with the doctor's, his voice sharp. I'm not questioning your expertise, doctor, Jacob said slowly, the words carefully chosen. But I'm wondering if maybe we need another opinion on this. Dr. Green met his gaze evenly, his expression unreadable. I understand your concern, he said, his tone still calm. You're her father, and it's natural to want the best care for her. But I believe that right now, the most important thing is to focus on her recovery. Jacob's thoughts churned, the doctor's calm tone only deepening the storm inside him. How can he be so calm? How could Dr. Green remain so composed when everything in Jacob's world felt like it was falling apart? Before Jacob could respond, the shrill beep of an alarm shattered the tension. Both men turned toward the monitor. Jacob's breath hitched as Dr. Green's expression immediately shifted from calm to focused. Her oxygen levels are dropping, Dr. Green said quickly, moving toward the bedside and calling for a nurse. Panic surged through Jacob's chest like a tidal wave. He watched in horror as the medical team sprang into action, moving with urgency and precision. Everything happened so fast, a blur of frantic motion and measured commands. Jacob stood frozen, his body paralyzed by fear, his mind spiraling into a fog of confusion. Is she? His voice caught in his throat as the numbers on the monitor fluctuated, his heart hammering in his chest. For the first time, he realized just how completely out of his depth he was. I have no control here. None at all. The sound of the heart monitor had shifted from its usual steady rhythm to a rapid, unsettling beat. Jacob's eyes were locked on the chaos unfolding before him. Dr. Green's calm, urgent voice cut through the turmoil, issuing commands to the nurses. Her oxygen levels are unstable. Increase the O2 flow, Dr. Green ordered. The nurses moved swiftly, adjusting the tubes and wires as Jacob stood helpless, paralyzed in the corner. I can't do anything, he thought, his fear gnawing at him. In that moment, Jacob felt utterly powerless. This was his daughter, the one person in the world he had sworn to protect at all costs. And here he was, reduced to nothing more than a spectator, watching others fight to save her life. Time stretched endlessly. Each second felt like an eternity. The sound of the machines, the nurses' steady movements. It was a constant hum that filled the space, only amplifying Jacob's growing sense of helplessness. The minutes dragged on. Dr. Green worked with laser focus, his calm presence at odds with the turmoil Jacob felt inside. How could the doctor remain so controlled when everything felt like it was falling apart? But even as Jacob's anger and fear twisted inside him, he knew one thing. Emily's fate was now in the hands of the very man he didn't trust. When the crisis finally passed, and the machines returned to a stable rhythm, Jacob exhaled the breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Dr. Green wiped his brow, turning to him with a serious but calm expression. We've stabilized her, he said, his voice steady but far from reassuring. But we're not out of the woods yet. I'm going to run some more tests to ensure there's no swelling in her brain. Right now, it's critical that we stay on top of every change. Jacob nodded, his throat tight. He wanted to speak, wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he watched as Dr. Green left the room, leaving Jacob alone with his daughter, his hands shaking slightly as he sank into the chair beside Emily's bed. She looked so pale, so fragile, hooked up to machines that were keeping her alive. I can't lose her. I won't lose her, Jacob thought, his mind spinning. The hours that followed were a blur of tension and waiting. Jacob remained at Emily's side, watching the nurses as they checked her vitals, adjusted her medications. Dr. Green came and went, always calm, always focused. The hospital routine buzzed around them, but in Jacob's world, it was as if everything had stopped. The only thing that mattered was Emily, her fragile health hanging in the balance. By late afternoon, the results of the CT scan came back. Dr. Green entered the room, his face composed but with an edge of tension Jacob hadn't noticed before. We've reviewed the scans, Dr. Green said, his voice steady but serious. There's some swelling in her brain. It's not as severe as we feared, but it's still a concern. We're going to need to take immediate action to relieve the pressure. Jacob's stomach dropped. What does that mean? He thought. His heart pounded in his chest as the words registered. Surgery? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Green nodded. Yes, it's a delicate procedure, but it's necessary to ensure that the swelling doesn't cause further damage. The weight of those words hit Jacob like a hammer. Surgery. It was the one thing he had feared most, the one thing he never wanted to hear. And you're going to perform it? The question slipped out before he could stop it, his voice edged with doubt. Yes, Dr. Green replied, meeting Jacob's gaze evenly. I'll be leading the surgical team. I've performed this procedure many times, and I'm confident it's the best course of action for Emily. Fear crashed over Jacob in waves. The thought of his daughter undergoing surgery, any surgery, was terrifying. But even more terrifying was the realization that for the first time in his life, he was going to have to trust someone he had once dismissed, based on nothing but the color of their skin. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to push the fear aside. This is no longer about me. It's about Emily. Do whatever you need to do, Jacob said, his voice steady but filled with the weight of the decision. Just save my daughter. Dr. Green nodded, his eyes filled with quiet determination. We'll take good care of her, Mr. Fenton. I promise. As Jacob sat in the sterile waiting room, the minutes stretched on like an eternity. The sound of the clock on the wall seemed to echo in his mind. Emily was in surgery, her life in the hands of Dr. Green. For the first time in his life, Jacob had to relinquish control, to trust someone else with the most important thing in his world. Every tick of the clock, every passing second, seemed to bring him closer to the edge. How could he just sit here? How could he do nothing when his daughter's life hung in the balance? Jacob sat in the sterile waiting room, his thoughts a whirlwind of fear and longing. As he waited for news, his mind drifted, pulling him back through the years to memories of Emily as a little girl. How many times had he watched her grow? From her first steps to the time she wobbled down the driveway on her bike, a determined look on her face. He had been there, always so proud, so certain she would grow up strong, independent, successful. He had envisioned her future, a future shaped by all the opportunities he could provide. But none of his wealth, none of his connections could protect her now. None of it could shield her from this. The life he had meticulously planned for her, the education, the career, the happiness, now hung in the balance. And here he was utterly powerless. A man he had once dismissed, someone he never thought twice about, now held her fate in his hands. How had it come to this? His mind replayed the moments before the surgery, when Dr. Green had spoken to him. Calm, composed, a man who exuded confidence, a confidence Jacob, in his panic and prejudice, had mistaken for indifference. But now, as he sat alone in the cold, sterile room, the truth became painfully clear. Dr. Green was anything but indifferent. He was focused, resolute, pouring every ounce of his expertise into saving Emily's life. And Jacob, who had always prided himself on being the protector, the provider, was now helpless. The difference was so painfully obvious. Dr. Green had the skills, the knowledge, the experience that Jacob lacked. It was humbling, even bitter. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and in walked Dr. Green. His white coat was a little rumpled from hours of surgery, but his demeanor remained steady and reassuring. Mr. Fenton, he said quietly, as though he'd already known how the moment would unfold. Jacob's heart seemed to stop as Dr. Green delivered the news. The surgery was a success. Emily was going to be okay. She was going to be okay. The words didn't immediately sink in. He stood there frozen, struggling to grasp the weight of the relief that surged through him. He hadn't allowed himself to feel it until now. The crushing fear, the tight grip of doubt, had kept him from truly believing. He stared at Dr. Green, his throat tight. "Thank you," Jacob finally managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for saving my daughter." Dr. Green gave a small nod, as though the gratitude was just part of the job. "It's what we're here for, Mr. Fenton. Emily's a strong young woman. She has a good chance of making a full recovery." Tears filled Jacob's eyes, tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years. For so long, he had believed that strength meant holding it all in. Control was his shield. But now, standing in this moment, he realized that true strength was something entirely different. It was trusting others, letting go of the things that didn't matter, and accepting uncomfortable truths about himself. Dr. Green, Jacob began, his voice faltering. I owe you an apology. I let my own ignorance get in the way. I judged you before I even gave you a chance. And for that I'm sorry. Dr. Green's expression softened. Mr. Fenton, I understand. These situations bring out a lot of emotions in people. What matters is that your daughter is safe. That's what counts now. Jacob swallowed hard, nodding. I was wrong. And I need you to know that I see that now. Dr. Green offered a gentle smile. Thank you. I appreciate that. But the most important thing right now is that Emily recovers. Jacob nodded, the weight of his apology settling between them. It wasn't enough to undo the past. He could never undo the mistakes he'd made. But it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the stirring of clarity within himself. As the days passed, Emily's recovery unfolded slowly but steadily. Each small improvement, from the reduction in swelling to the first flutter of her eyelids, was a victory for Jacob. And with every visit from Dr. Green, a new sense of awe and respect grew within him. The doctor wasn't just a skilled surgeon. He was a compassionate, unshakable presence in Emily's care. Dr. Green saw past the surface. He treated Emily as a person, not a case. How had Jacob missed that before? 2 weeks later, when Emily was finally moved from the ICU to a regular room, Jacob walked behind her bed, his chest swelling with pride. The room was bright, flooded with sunlight from a large window. As the nurses settled her in, Emily glanced out at the view and whispered, "Look at that view. It's beautiful." Jacob's heart softened. "Not as beautiful as seeing you getting better," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily offered a faint smile, her eyes moist with unshed tears. "Thanks for staying with me, Dad." For the first time, Jacob realized that being there for her wasn't just about providing the best education, the best opportunities, the best of everything. It was about something deeper, something he had nearly missed. He had nearly let his own biases, his misconceptions, get in the way of what truly mattered. As Emily rested later that day, Jacob stepped into the hallway to clear his mind. He found himself pacing, replaying the past few weeks in his head. His thoughts kept circling back to Dr. Green, his grace, his professionalism. How could Jacob have misjudged him so completely? And then, as if on cue, Dr. Green appeared at the end of the hallway, clipboard in hand. He greeted Jacob calmly and asked about Emily's progress. Jacob's chest tightened, but he managed to smile. "She's doing well. Better every day. Thanks to you." Dr. Green gave a modest nod. "I'm glad to hear that. She's made remarkable progress. I'm confident she'll continue to improve." But Jacob couldn't let it go. It was time to face the elephant in the room. "Dr. Green," he began slowly, "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. And I just want to say, I'm sorry. Not just for how I acted, but for how I judged you. Without even realizing it." Dr. Green paused, his expression thoughtful. "We all carry biases, Mr. Fenton, whether we realize it or not. What matters is that you've recognized yours, and you're willing to learn from it. That's not easy." Jacob nodded, feeling something inside him shift. "I'm trying. I want to be better, not just for Emily but for myself too." Dr. Green extended his hand, and this time Jacob didn't hesitate. The handshake felt like a seal of understanding, one that didn't need words. Months passed, and Emily's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. Jacob stood by her side, watching her regain her strength, her spirit undiminished. The ordeal had changed him, not just as a father, but as a person. He had been forced to confront the ugliness within himself, but in doing so, he had found the chance to grow. One afternoon, Jacob invited Dr. Green to lunch as a way to thank him. Over a quiet meal, the two men talked about their lives, their families, and their shared experiences. Never in his life would Jacob have thought such a conversation would feel so natural. But now it did. As time passed, Jacob realized that he hadn't just gained a new perspective. He'd gained a friend. Later, as he walked through Central Park with Emily, laughing and joking with friends, Jacob couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, something that had eluded him for so long. The weight of the past few months had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and clarity. He had been given a second chance, not just with Emily but with himself. And he wasn't about to waste it. "Are you okay, Dad?" Emily asked, glancing up at him with a playful smile. "You seem quiet." Jacob smiled back, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. "I'm okay," he said softly. "Just thinking about how lucky I am to have you." Emily rolled her eyes, laughing. "Well, I guess you're pretty lucky." Jacob chuckled, his heart filled with a love deeper than he'd ever known. "More than you know, sweetheart. More than you know." And together, they walked side by side, the future stretching out before them, bright, hopeful, and free of the shadows of the past.